On a sunny afternoon in a quiet neighborhood park, something happened that no one expected. A black teenager, Jamal, sat under a tree, minding his own business. Suddenly, the police chief of the town walked toward him, accusing him of being in a place he didn't belong. The chief demanded answers, raising his voice for everyone to hear. Jamal stayed calm, trying to explain, but the situation quickly escalated. The chief's next actions left the crowd stunned, and what followed changed everything in an instant. Who is Jamal, and why did the chief target him? What happened that led to the chief's downfall? And how did this one moment shake an entire community? Before we dive into this unbelievable story, take a moment to tell us, where are you watching this video from? Comment below and let us know. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss these eye-opening stories. By the end of this story, you'll understand why even those in power are not above the law, and how courage and truth can turn the tide against injustice. Jamal, a 16-year-old with big dreams, had just moved to this small town with his family. He was known for his bright smile, kind heart, and love for science. On this particular day, he went to the park with a notebook full of ideas for a school project. The park was a lively place. Families played together, kids laughed, and teens gathered for games. Jamal found a quiet spot under a tree, enjoying the warm weather while sketching his ideas. He was new to the area and hoped to make some friends soon. But not everyone in the park was as welcoming. The town's police chief, Mr. Hayes, was walking through the park. He had a reputation for being strict and believed it was his job to keep order. To some, this meant ensuring safety. To others, it meant targeting those he thought didn't belong. When Mr. Hayes noticed Jamal, something about the teen caught his attention. Maybe it was because he didn't recognize him, or maybe it was because Jamal wasn't like most people in the neighborhood. Whatever it was, the chief decided to act. The chief watched Jamal for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then he walked toward him. Jamal didn't notice at first, lost in his sketches, but when the chief's shadow loomed over him, Jamal looked up, surprised. "Hey, you," the chief said. "What are you doing here?" Jamal, confused but polite, answered, "I'm just sitting here, working on my project." The chief wasn't satisfied. "Do you live around here? Do you have an ID to prove it?" Jamal shook his head. "I didn't bring my ID. I didn't think I'd need it to come to the park." That answer didn't sit well with the chief. In his mind, anyone without proof didn't belong. He crossed his arms and stared at Jamal, his tone sharp. "If you can't prove you live here, you might be trespassing." Jamal tried to explain again, but the chief wouldn't listen. Around them, a few people started to notice the conversation. Some whispered to each other, while others kept their heads down, not wanting to get involved. Jamal felt his heart race as the chief's tone became sharper. The chief stepped closer, his imposing presence casting a shadow over Jamal. The teen hadn't done anything wrong and didn't understand why he was being singled out. "Look," Jamal said, trying to remain calm, "I live here. My family just moved to the neighborhood last month." The chief crossed his arms, his expression hard. "I've been in this town for over 20 years, and I know everyone who lives here. I've never seen you before." Jamal looked around, hoping someone in the crowd would come to his defense. A group of parents sitting on benches nearby glanced in his direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. A few teenagers who had been playing basketball paused their game and watched, their faces showing quiet concern. But no one spoke up. The chief wasn't satisfied with Jamal's polite explanation. His voice grew louder, drawing more attention. "Show me some proof, or I'll have to escort you out of here." Jamal shook his head slightly, keeping his voice even. "Sir, I told you, I didn't bring any ID. I didn't think I'd need to carry it to come to a public park." But the chief's patience seemed to snap. He pulled out his radio and spoke into it, his voice sharp and authoritative. "We've got a situation here. Possible trespasser at the park. Send backup." Around them, whispers started spreading through the park like wildfire. People exchanged glances, their murmurs growing louder. "What's going on?" a woman asked her husband. "It's that boy," the man replied. "The chief thinks he doesn't belong here." "But he's just sitting there," another voice chimed in. "He's not causing any trouble." Jamal remained seated, gripping his notebook tightly. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. Looking up at the chief, he said firmly, "I haven't done anything wrong. You're making a mistake." The chief leaned forward, his smirk cold and condescending. "You're not cooperating, kid. That tells me everything I need to know." By now, several people in the park had started recording the encounter on their phones. Some whispered to one another, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. A little girl, no older than 8, tugged on her mother's arm and asked, "Why is that man yelling at him?" Her mother, visibly uneasy, whispered back, "It's complicated, honey. Just stay quiet." Jamal took a deep breath, trying one more time to explain. "My name is Jamal, and I just moved here with my family. We live on Cedar Lane. You can ask anyone." But the chief wasn't interested in listening. He crossed his arms, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How convenient. Anyone can say that. But until you prove it, you're coming with me." The tension in the park grew unbearable. Jamal noticed more and more people stopping to watch, but no one stepped forward. The silence felt deafening. The crowd seemed frozen, unsure of what to do. "Leave him alone," a young man suddenly shouted. His voice rang out, cutting through the murmurs. "He's not doing anything wrong." Another woman added, "This is ridiculous. He's just a kid." Despite the growing unease among the crowd, the chief ignored them. He reached down and grabbed Jamal's arm, his grip firm and unrelenting. The crowd collectively gasped as Jamal stood up slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not resisting," Jamal said evenly. "But I didn't do anything wrong." The chief tightened his grip. "That's not how this works, kid." Jamal met his gaze, refusing to back down. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight. "You're making a mistake, sir." And then, just as the situation seemed on the brink of spiraling out of control, a voice from the crowd called out, loud and commanding, "Let him go. Right now." The voice that rang out from the crowd was calm but commanding. All heads turned to see a tall man stepping forward, dressed in a crisp shirt and tie. His presence was striking, and his tone carried authority. "Let him go," the man repeated. The chief hesitated for a moment but quickly regained his composure. "And who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the chief. "I'm his father," he said firmly, "and I'd like to know why you're harassing my son." Jamal's face lit up with relief. "Dad," he said softly. The crowd began murmuring again, but this time there was a shift. The man's calm confidence seemed to inspire people. A woman whispered to her friend, "That's Jamal's father? He looks like he means business." The chief, however, wasn't fazed. "Your son doesn't belong here. He has no proof of residency, and I'm doing my job to keep this area secure." Jamal's father crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "No proof? Since when does a teenager need to carry proof of residency to sit in a public park? The chief opened his mouth to respond, but the man continued, his voice steady and sharp. Let me tell you who I am. My name is Marcus Carter, and I'm a civil rights attorney. I've spent the last 20 years fighting against exactly this kind of behavior. You've targeted my son without cause, and you've escalated this situation unnecessarily. If you think I'm going to let this slide, you're mistaken. The crowd stirred. People whispered to one another, their voices growing louder. "That's his dad? A civil rights attorney?" one man said. "No wonder he's so confident," another replied. The chief's smug expression faltered, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Look, I'm just following protocol," he said. "I received a report about someone suspicious in the park, and I'm investigating." Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Suspicious? Sitting under a tree with a notebook makes him suspicious? Or is it because he's black?" The crowd gasped. The tension was palpable. Several people nodded in agreement while others looked at the chief, waiting for his response. "That's not what this is about," the chief said quickly, his tone defensive. "Then what is it about?" Marcus shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, this looks like racial profiling." At that moment, a young woman holding her phone stepped forward. "I've been recording this whole thing," she said. "It's all on video. The way you've treated him, the way you've ignored his explanations, it's all here." The chief turned to the woman, his expression a mix of anger and panic. "Put that phone away," he barked. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "The world deserves to see this." More phones were raised. The crowd was no longer silent. People were speaking up, voicing their support for Jamal and his father. "This isn't right," a man shouted. "Leave the kid alone," another yelled. The chief looked around, realizing he was losing control of the situation. His authority, once so firm, was slipping away. Meanwhile, Marcus turned to his son and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, Jamal?" he asked softly. Jamal nodded, his voice steady despite the situation. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just don't understand why this is happening." Marcus' expression hardened. "You don't deserve this, son. No one does." Turning back to the chief, Marcus said, "This ends now. You're going to let my son go, and you're going to apologize to him." The chief's jaw tightened. "I don't have to do anything," he snapped. Just then, another man stepped forward from the crowd. He was older, dressed in casual clothes, but his voice carried authority. "Chief Hayes," the man said, "this has gone too far." The chief turned to him, surprised. "Patrick, what are you doing here?" "I've been watching," the man replied, "and I'm ashamed. I've lived in this town for 30 years, and I've seen this park welcome people from all walks of life. What you're doing right now isn't protecting anyone. It's hurting a kid and embarrassing this community." The crowd erupted into applause. Marcus nodded in appreciation. The chief took a step back, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered. "No," Patrick said firmly. "You're abusing your power." At that moment, another voice broke through the noise. "This is going live," a young man announced, holding up his phone. "Thousands of people are watching right now." The chief froze. He glanced around at the crowd, the raised phones, and the unwavering expressions on their faces. He knew he was cornered. "I suggest you think carefully about your next move," Marcus said. The chief looked at Marcus, then at Jamal, and finally at the crowd. Slowly, he released his grip on Jamal's arm. The crowd cheered as Jamal stepped back, rubbing his wrist. Marcus placed an arm around his son's shoulders. "You're going to hear from me again," he told the chief. "This isn't over." The chief didn't respond. His face was pale, and he looked as though the weight of the situation had finally hit him. As Marcus and Jamal walked away, the crowd parted to let them through. People clapped, patted Jamal on the back, and offered words of support. But the chief stood frozen in place, his reputation crumbling before his eyes. The incident at the park didn't end when Marcus and Jamal walked away. It was just the beginning of something far greater. By evening, a short video of the confrontation started circulating online. The video captured the intense exchange between Chief Hayes and Marcus. It showed Jamal standing with quiet dignity, refusing to be intimidated, and Marcus stepping in with commanding words, "This isn't over." Within hours, the video exploded on social media. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a national conversation. Comments and reactions poured in, fueling outrage and support. This is why systemic racism needs to end. Salute to that father for protecting his son. How many times do we have to watch the same story play out? This has to stop. By morning, major news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines read, "Police chief accused of racial profiling sparks outrage," and "Father defends teen son against unjust arrest attempt." The town was abuzz with discussions. At the diner on Main Street, customers debated what had happened. "I've lived here my whole life," one older man said. "This isn't the kind of town I want to be part of anymore." "I knew Hayes was strict," a woman replied. "But this, targeting a kid, that's not strict. It's cruel." Meanwhile, younger residents took to social media. One resident organized a peaceful rally at the park, calling it "Justice for Jamal." "This isn't just about one boy," their post read. "It's about all the people who faced the same treatment and didn't have someone like Marcus to stand up for them." At City Hall, the mayor and city council held an emergency meeting. Mayor Ellen Harris looked visibly upset as she addressed the council. "This isn't just a public relations issue," she said. "This is about our town's integrity. If we don't take swift action, we'll lose the trust of our community." One council member sighed. "This isn't the first time we've heard complaints about Hayes, but this is the first time there's been proof we can't ignore." Another added, "The video makes it clear he escalated a situation that didn't need to happen. This isn't about keeping the town safe. It's about bias." Mayor Harris nodded. "Let's bring him in for questioning. He owes this council and this town an explanation." When Chief Hayes arrived at City Hall, he looked tense. The confident man who once commanded respect now seemed unsure of himself. "Chief Hayes," the mayor began, her tone sharp, "you've seen the video. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The chief hesitated. "I was doing my job," he said. "I got a report about someone suspicious, and I investigated." "Suspicious?" the mayor replied. "Sitting under a tree is suspicious. Writing in a notebook is suspicious." "He didn't have ID," Hayes muttered. "Since when does someone need ID to sit in a public park?" Hayes didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. Hundreds of people gathered at the park for the rally. They held signs that read, "Justice for Jamal," and "End Racial Profiling Now." Parents brought their children, teens stood together in solidarity, and community leaders took the stage to speak. Marcus addressed the crowd first. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about Jamal," he said. "It's about every kid who's been judged unfairly. every person who's been stopped, questioned, and made to feel like they don't belong. Today, we stand together to say, enough is enough. The crowd erupted in applause. Next, Jamal stepped forward. Though quieter, his words carried weight. "I just wanted to sit in the park and work on my school project," he began. "I didn't think something like this could happen to me. But I'm glad to see so many of you here today. It shows that when we stand together, we can make a difference." People cheered and several wiped tears from their eyes. At City Hall, the council deliberated for hours. When they finally called Chief Hayes back into the room, the decision had been made. "Chief Hayes," Mayor Harris said, her voice firm, "after reviewing the video and hearing from witnesses, it's clear your actions were not only inappropriate, but harmful. You've brought shame to this town and violated the trust placed in you as a leader." Hayes's face reddened. "I was just doing my job," he said defensively. "No," the mayor replied, her tone cutting. "You abused your power. Effective immediately. You are relieved of your duties." The chief slammed his hand on the table. "You can't do this." "Yes, we can," the mayor replied. "And we have." The news of Hayes's dismissal spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to many. But for others, it was a reminder that this was only the first step. The town knew that firing Hayes wasn't enough. To rebuild trust, the council announced several new initiatives. Bias training for officers would become mandatory, focusing on de-escalation tactics and addressing implicit biases. A community oversight committee would be established to review police actions and ensure accountability. Monthly open forums would give citizens a platform to voice their concerns and experiences. At the first forum, Marcus stood before a packed room. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," he said. "It's about creating something better. We owe it to ourselves, our neighbors, and our children to build a community where everyone feels safe and respected." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of hope. For Jamal, the experience was life-changing. He received letters and messages from people across the country, many of whom shared similar stories of discrimination. One evening, Marcus walked into Jamal's room to find him reading one of those letters. "How are you feeling, son?" Marcus asked. Jamal looked up and smiled. "Better," he said. "It's good to know we're not alone." Marcus nodded. "You're never alone, Jamal. And remember, it's not just about what happens to us. It's about how we respond. That's what defines us." The incident at the park became a turning point, not just for Jamal and Marcus, but for the entire town. It was a wake-up call for many and a reminder that silence in the face of injustice only makes things worse. "This isn't about one person or one moment," Marcus said in a later interview. "It's about changing the culture that allowed this to happen. That's the legacy I want for my son, and for all our children." Jamal agreed. "It's not just about standing up for yourself," he said. "It's about standing up for others, too." The ripple effects of that day continued for years. The community became a model for others, showing how accountability and action could bring about real change. And Jamal? He went on to become a leader in his own right, inspired by the courage his father showed that day in the park. The incident at the park didn't end when Marcus and Jamal walked away. It was just the beginning of something far bigger. That evening, a short video of the confrontation began circulating online. It captured the tense exchange between Chief Hayes and Marcus, with Jamal standing firm and composed, refusing to let the chief's intimidation overwhelm him. The video ended with Marcus's powerful declaration, "This isn't over." Within hours, the video exploded across social media platforms. Comments flooded in from people around the country. "This is why we still need to fight for equality." "Big respect to the father, he handled it perfectly." How many more kids have to go through this? Enough is enough. By the next morning, news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters sought interviews, and hashtags like "Justice for Jamal" and "End Racial Profiling" trended nationwide. The once quiet town found itself at the center of a heated national debate about racial bias and police conduct. In the diner on Main Street, locals debated the incident over their morning coffee. "This doesn't feel like our town anymore," one older man said, shaking his head. "This isn't the kind of place I want to live in." "I've known Hayes for years," another chimed in. "He's always been strict, but this time, he crossed the line." At the same time, younger residents turned to social media to share their thoughts. One post read, "We can't let this slide. It's not just about Jamal. It's about all the kids who've been treated unfairly and didn't have someone like Marcus to protect them." The post quickly gained traction, inspiring a local activist group to organize a rally in support of Jamal. "Justice for Jamal," the flyers read, "because enough is enough." At City Hall, the mayor and city council were holding an emergency meeting. Mayor Ellen Harris, known for her no-nonsense leadership, sat at the head of the table, her hands folded tightly. "This is a crisis," she began. "We can't ignore what happened. That video is everywhere, and it's damaging our town's reputation." One council member sighed. "This isn't the first complaint we've had about Hayes, but this time there's evidence. We can't sweep it under the rug." Another council member added, "The community is watching us closely. If we don't take action, we'll lose their trust forever." The mayor nodded. "Then let's call him in. He owes us an explanation." When Chief Hayes arrived, his confidence seemed shaken. He avoided meeting the mayor's eyes as he sat across the table. "Chief Hayes," Ellen began, her tone stern, "you've seen the video. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" The chief cleared his throat. "I was just doing my job," he said. "I got a report about someone suspicious, and I acted on it." "Suspicious?" Ellen asked sharply. "Sitting under a tree with a notebook is suspicious?" "He didn't have ID," Hayes replied weakly. "Since when does someone need ID to sit in a public park?" Hayes didn't answer. His silence was damning. Meanwhile, hundreds of people gathered at the park for the rally. Parents brought their children, teens stood together in solidarity, and community leaders took the stage to speak. Signs reading, "Justice for Jamal," and "End Racial Profiling Now," filled the air. Marcus addressed the crowd first. He spoke calmly, but passionately. "This isn't just about Jamal," he said. "It's about every kid who's been judged unfairly, every person who's been stopped, questioned, and made to feel like they don't belong. Today, we stand together to say, enough is enough." The crowd roared with applause. Next, Jamal stepped forward. Though quieter than his father, his words carried a profound weight. "I just wanted to sit in the park and work on my school project," he began. "I didn't think something like this could happen to me, but seeing all of you here today makes me feel like we can make a difference. Thank you for standing with me." Tears welled up in the eyes of several attendees. Jamal's courage had touched them deeply. As the rally continued, the city council deliberated over Hayes's future. The decision wasn't easy, but after hours of discussion, They reached a conclusion. Hayes was called back into the room where Mayor Harris delivered the verdict. "Chief Hayes," she began, "after reviewing the video and hearing from witnesses, it's clear your actions were not only inappropriate but harmful. You've brought shame to this town and violated the trust placed in you as a leader." Hayes's face turned red. "I was just doing my job," he said defensively. "No," Ellen replied firmly. "You abused your power. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties." The chief slammed his hand on the table. "Yes, we can," Ellen said, her tone unwavering. "And we have. This decision is final." News of Hayes's dismissal spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to many in the community. But for others, it was a reminder that firing one person wouldn't solve the deeper issues at hand. To rebuild trust, the City Council announced several new initiatives. Bias training for police officers would be mandatory, with a focus on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. A community oversight committee would be established to monitor police actions and ensure accountability. Monthly open forums would give citizens a chance to voice their concerns directly to local leaders. At the first forum, Marcus stood before a packed room. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," he said. "It's about creating something better. We owe it to ourselves, our neighbors, and our children to build a community where everyone feels safe and respected." The room erupted in applause. For Jamal, the experience was transformative. Messages of support poured in from around the country, many of them from people who had faced similar struggles. One evening, Marcus walked into Jamal's room to find him reading one of those messages. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked gently. Jamal looked up and smiled. "It feels good to know we're not alone," he said. "You're never alone," Marcus replied. "And remember, it's not just about what happens to us. It's about how we respond. That's what defines us." The incident at the park became a turning point for the entire town. It forced people to confront their own biases and take a stand against injustice. Neighbors who had once been strangers began working together to create a more inclusive community. "This isn't about one person or one moment," Marcus said in a later interview. "It's about changing the culture that allowed this to happen. That's the legacy I want for my son, and for all our children." Jamal agreed. "It's not just about standing up for yourself," he said. "It's about standing up for others too." The ripple effects of that day were felt for years. The town became a model for others, showing how accountability and action could bring about real change. And Jamal? He went on to become a leader in his own right, inspired by the courage his father had shown that day in the park. The aftermath of the rally marked the beginning of something much larger for the community. Chief Hayes's dismissal was only the first step in the long journey toward healing and accountability. The town, now watching intently, needed more than just action. It needed transformation. And that transformation began to take root in unexpected ways. As the weeks passed, the rally that had taken place in the park became a turning point for many residents. The town's leaders worked tirelessly to set the stage for future growth. While some still held on to their old beliefs, the majority understood the importance of creating a space where no one, especially children, felt unsafe. What happened to Jamal was a harsh reminder that systemic issues existed, even in places that prided themselves on being peaceful and fair. Marcus, once just a father standing up for his son, had become a symbol of resilience and justice. He spent hours talking to community leaders, organizing meetings, and advocating for continued change. He knew the work was far from over. In his eyes, this wasn't just about one individual being held accountable, but about a shift in the town's collective mindset. It was about changing how people viewed power, authority, and fairness. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Marcus sat down with Jamal. They had a quiet moment together, just the two of them. Jamal had come a long way in those few short weeks. He had received letters of support from all over the country. The voices of strangers were now echoing in his life, and they were all saying the same thing. You matter. Your story matters. How do you feel? Marcus asked gently as he looked at his son. Jamal smiled faintly. I feel... I don't know. Like I've been part of something bigger than just me. Like we all have a role to play in making sure things like this don't happen again. Marcus nodded, proud of the young man his son had become. That's the point, son. When we speak up, when we stand up for what's right, it affects more than just our lives. It can change everything. The days that followed were filled with continued public discussion. The community held open forums where people shared their concerns about policing, race, and what steps could be taken to prevent future injustice. For the first time, residents of all backgrounds came together to voice their opinions without fear of being ignored. It was an uncomfortable but necessary step forward. Some voiced their regret for staying silent when they saw Jamal being mistreated in the park. Others questioned their own actions and inactions. Many came forward to apologize and express their desire to be part of the change. It was a humbling moment for all involved. The story of what had happened in the park, and of how the community came together to right a wrong, began to spread far beyond their town. Other cities reached out for advice, and the movement started to gain momentum. It was no longer just about Jamal. It was about creating a nationwide conversation about race, policing, and the power of standing together. As the weeks passed, changes began to take place in the town. A community advisory board was formed to ensure that the voices of marginalized groups were heard. The town council created a series of new initiatives to support diversity and inclusion, while also holding law enforcement accountable. Chief Hayes's actions served as a catalyst for growth, forcing everyone to re-examine their values and how they contributed to the culture around them. And yet, even as these changes took shape, Marcus and Jamal knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be those who resisted change, who clung to old ways of thinking. But they also knew that the only way to move forward was by confronting those challenges head-on. Jamal, now a young man with an ever-growing sense of purpose, took up the cause of justice. He spoke at schools, attended rallies, and helped organize local events that brought people together. Every day he was reminded of the importance of speaking out, of standing firm against injustice, no matter how daunting the task seemed. For Marcus, the fight was deeply personal. It was about more than just his son. It was about every person who had ever felt excluded, undervalued, or targeted. He understood that this battle was ongoing, and he was determined to do his part. The work was slow, but with each conversation, each small victory, things were changing. The work the community had started was just the beginning. As people continued to have difficult conversations and reflect on their own biases, the atmosphere in the town shifted. It was no longer a place where silence in the face of injustice was acceptable. People had learned that speaking up could bring about real change, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Years later, Jamal would look back on that day in the park with mixed emotions. He remembered the fear, the confusion, and the overwhelming sense of being judged unfairly. But he also remembered the strength of his father, the courage of the community, and the power of standing up when it mattered most. "Dad, do you think people really change?" Jamal asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their home. Marcus glanced at his son, his expression thoughtful. People can change, he said slowly, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes hard work, it takes patience, and most importantly, it takes the willingness to look at things from a different perspective. Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. I hope we keep changing, he said quietly, for the better. And with that, the town continued its slow but steady progress toward becoming a more just and inclusive place. The story of Jamal, his father, and their community would live on as a reminder of the power of courage, the importance of speaking up, and the unyielding hope for a better future. The park incident had been the spark, but it was only the beginning of the change that would transform not only their town, but countless others. It was a powerful lesson about how one action, one voice, one moment of courage could change the course of history. As the days went by, the town began to feel different. The tension that had once hung over it like a heavy cloud started to lift, and a sense of hope began to spread. Marcus and Jamal knew their fight wasn't over, but they could see the first steps toward lasting change. The town was moving toward healing, and the work that had started in the park was slowly becoming a movement. Marcus, ever the dedicated father, found himself more involved than ever before. He continued to speak at public forums, working with local leaders to ensure that the issues of bias and racial profiling were addressed in concrete ways. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary for the future of his children and for all the children in the town. Jamal, too, found new purpose in the aftermath of the incident. He became involved in local initiatives, helping to organize events that fostered unity, understanding, and empathy. What had started as a personal ordeal had now shaped him into a young man determined to make a difference. People began to recognize the power of collective action. The community, once divided by fear and suspicion, now stood together, determined to confront injustice whenever it reared its ugly head. They had seen firsthand how one act of courage could ripple through the lives of everyone involved and create lasting change. The conversation around police reform continued, and the changes set in motion by the town council began to take shape. The initiative to include bias training for law enforcement officers became standard, and more citizens felt empowered to speak out when they saw something wrong. For the first time in a long time, the town was truly coming together. In the years that followed, the events of that day remained a defining moment. Jamal grew into a leader in his own right, advocating for justice, equality, and the importance of standing up for others. The lessons learned from that painful moment had left an indelible mark on the community. Jamal and Marcus knew the fight for equality would never be simple. But they also knew that every step forward mattered. They had witnessed firsthand the change that could come when people refused to stay silent when they chose to speak out against injustice. This was just the beginning. The story of their town was now part of something bigger, something that spread beyond their small community and encouraged others to take action. They had shown that, even in the face of adversity, courage could bring about a transformation that would echo for years to come. If you've ever been moved by a story like this, take a moment to think about your own community. What change can you help bring about? It starts with one voice, one action, and the willingness to speak up for what is right. Share your thoughts, spread the word, and let's continue the conversation together. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Stay connected, stay informed, and let's keep fighting for the world we all deserve.